creepy horror stories.
Mark had lived in the same apartment building, specially apartment 3C, for over 2 years, and until recently, he had no reason to think anything was amiss. But then the crying started. It was subtle at first, a faint, pitiful whimper that Mark could almost convince himself was part of the noise from the city outside. But over the course of a week, it grew louder, more persistent. A baby, crying, nonstop. At first, he assumed it was the neighbors next door, apartment 3B, perhaps a newborn who just couldn't settle. But as the days passed, something about the crying began to gnaw at him. It wasn't normal. It wasn't human. The cries, though unmistakably the sound of an infant, had a twisted quality, guttural and otherworldly. They seemed to reverberate through the walls, as though the baby were right next to him, calling out in pain or fear. Mark would lie in his bed at night, staring at the ceiling, gripped by an inexplicable terror. The walls in the building were thin, and the crying felt so close that it was as though the baby were in his own room. Yet, when he looked over to the adjacent wall, the one separating his apartment, 3C, from 3B, there was nothing there. The crying continued, night after night. It wasn't just the sound that disturbed him, it was the way it echoed, like it was coming from deep underground or from an endless cavern of sorrow. Mark started noticing strange things. His nights were filled with restless nightmares of things lurking in the darkness, creatures with wide black eyes and long bony hands reaching toward him. And still, the baby cried. Then, one night, the crying became unbearable. It was louder than ever before, echoing through the walls like the wail of something in agony. Mark couldn't take it any longer. He had to do something. He grabbed his shoes and stormed out of his apartment, the sounds of the baby's cries following him down the hall. He approached the door to 3B, his fist trembling as he raised it to knock. But as his hand hovered in midair, the door creaked open on its own, the hinges groaning as though they hadn't been used in years. A chill ran down his spine. He didn't think twice. He pushed the door all the way open and stepped inside. "Hello?" His voice echoed in the emptiness, but there was no answer. The apartment was dark, the faint smell of mildew heavy in the air. The cries were still there, louder now, almost deafening. Mark's heart raced, but he forced himself to take another step. He couldn't just stand there. The baby needs help. The apartment was in disarray. Old furniture was piled haphazardly in corners, and broken picture frames littered the floor. It looked abandoned, as though the person who lived there had disappeared long ago. The baby's cries echoed through the apartment, but there was no sign of the infant. He turned down the hall and reached a bedroom at the end of the corridor. The door was slightly ajar, and the room beyond was lit by a flickering dim light. The crying grew louder, more insistent, but Mark couldn't see where it was coming from. He stepped inside. The sight he saw made his stomach drop. A figure knelt beside the wall, rocking back and forth in a grotesque imitation of a parent comforting a child. Its body was too long, too thin, and its skin was stretched tight over its skeletal frame, as though it had been pulled too thin to contain the thing inside. Its hair hung in matted clumps around its face, and its eyes, those wide, empty, black pits, stared straight at Mark, hollow and cold. It was crying, but the sound that filled the room wasn't the soft, innocent cry of a baby. No, it was something far worse. A twisted, gurgling, demonic wail that sounded as though the very walls were breaking under the weight of it. The creature's hands, bony and gnarled, clutched at its chest as it rocked back and forth. its body jerking with each sob. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He took a step back, but before he could move, the creature's head snapped toward him. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth that looked far too large for its face. It smiled, if that's what you could call it, a grin filled with malice, revealing more of those horrendous teeth. The creature's mouth opened further, and in a voice that wasn't quite human, it rasped, "You came to help, Amanda?" Mark couldn't answer. Fear gripped him, paralyzing him in place as the creature's eyes bore into his soul. The wail grew louder, and before he could react, the thing lunged at him with inhuman speed, its hands outstretched to grab him. Mark turned and ran. He reached the door, but as his hand grabbed the knob, it slammed shut with a deafening crash. The walls trembled. The cries were now a full-on scream, a guttural, horrible sound that rattled his very bones. He turned and looked at the room around him. Everything was closing in. The walls seemed to bend inward, the very air suffocating him. He could hear it behind him, the thing's footsteps growing closer, louder. It was coming for him. With his heart pounding, Mark ran to a window and threw it open, but all he could see was darkness. No street lights, no sign of the outside world, just the endless, suffocating night. "Number, please," he whispered to himself, but it was no use. The creature was here, it was in the room, and it was getting closer. He turned around to face it. It was standing in front of him, staring at Mark with its solid black eyes. The creature picks up Mark by the neck and screams in his face. The long, endless scream sounds like a baby's scream, but demonic. Mark, unable to bear both the screaming and the choking, quickly faints. And then there was silence. Weeks later, a new tenant named John moved into apartment 3D. It was quiet at first, but then, on the third night, the crying began, soft at first, like the whimper of a newborn. After a few days, John, hearing the baby's cries through the thin walls every night, couldn't ignore it. He knocked on the door of 3C, but when no one answered, the door opened on its own, creaking softly. He stepped inside, calling out, "Hello? Is everything all right in here?" But the apartment was empty. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The baby's cries echoed through the hallways. John followed the sound down the corridor and into the bedroom. The room was dark, and the baby's cries grew louder, more frantic, almost as if it were pleading for help. And there, crouched beside the wall, rocking back and forth, was a tall, skeletal figure. Its long, thin arms cradled its chest as it cried, a sound that was both familiar and wrong. It snapped his head toward John, its eyes hollow, black, endless. The creature smiled, and, in a voice that wasn't quite human, it rasped, "You came to help, Mark?"